Good morning, good afternoon. Hope you guys can hear me okay. Actually, I'm just going to stop sharing briefly to make sure that you can hear me. Awesome. All right. We're really glad that you guys could join us. I am going to share my screen here. And for this webinar, we're going to go through some of the stuff that we've gone through in other webinars, especially around the tactics of how one does testing for voice. But we also wanted to start off with some explanation about why testing is very important. Because we do think that for voice and for AI, there's some really interesting aspects to it that people should be cognizant of and be thinking about as you start working on these new platforms. So just some quick introductions and housekeeping. For one thing, this webinar is recorded and we will send out the recordings afterwards. So for those of you that are not attending or if you drop off during it, just know that you'll be able to get the rest. Additionally, we have some poll questions there, which we would love it if you would answer. We appreciate the feedback and the information that you give to us. And then lastly, you can ask us questions during the course of this in the chat window there. I'm not going to be able to see that as you're entering it, but I'm actually separately looking at my phone, and the guys, other Bespoken folks on the call will forward those questions to me. So we can try to address those as we go through the presentation. And so with that, as introductions, I'm John Kelvey. I'm CEO and founder of Bespoken. Additionally, joining us in the live storm there, Bo, Yvonne, and Fiorella. They can all respond to any questions that you have that you put into the chat window there. And so about us, we provide monitoring and testing tools for voice apps. We are a recognized vendor of Amazon and Google. We have over 1,000 apps that we monitor, and we have more than 3,000 developers now using our tools. Additionally, something I would highlight about us is we have a long history with speech recognition and AI. So prior to Bespoken, I was actually building a company that provided speech recognition really at scale. It was for mobile and for an advertising use case. But just in the process of that, learned a lot about building speech recognition, but even more about testing it. And that, for me, was an introduction for why testing is so important for anything that you do with AI. Because what we found was anytime you made changes, there were side effects. And that's true of almost any software development, but particularly for things that are AI-based, you're not typically looking to just altogether resolve issues unless they're very shallow ones. Instead, what you're looking to do is to optimize. And so that was something I learned early on, was that when you're looking at these problems, you're looking to optimize. And so that means constantly looking across your entire application's performance and trying to get the best result, across all the different scenarios, as opposed to making, hoping each one of them will be perfect. So why does testing matter? I mean, there's a lot of reasons why it matters, but some of the particular things with voice, there's a study that the Washington Post did that demonstrated that voice apps have significant issues with accents. And so their performance for different accents versus a baseline, it would do much worse if you're talking with an Indian accent, a Chinese accent, a Spanish accent, versus a Midwestern or a Southern. And with Google Home, it had similar challenges of its own, and also other areas where it performed better. But this becomes a significant usability issue potentially for your users. You know, it's not just a matter of QA, but if people cannot interact with your app because it doesn't understand how they speak, that's a significant obstacle. Additionally, it's not just about languages and accents that are a challenge. What you run into is dealing with different environments. So when you're talking about a voice-based app, you can have people in the car, you can have people talking on headphones, you can have people, you know, interacting at home, but with kids and a family around, creating a lot of background noise. In all of those scenarios, that affects the performance of your app and affects the usability for people that are interacting with it. And so overall, this kind of works towards a thesis that we have, that we think it's important for people to keep in mind as they are building voice apps and they're thinking about these platforms, which is that we've moved towards an AI-based operating system with Alexa and Google Assistant. And those platforms are really fantastic. And you know, one of the real great benefits of it is that it actually does make development easier. It makes development easier by providing tools like dialogues, which a lot of you may be familiar with. You know, dialogue, you can say, go collect these 4 pieces of data, like for a travel app. Go find out where the person is leaving from, where they're going to, what time they're leaving, what time do they want to return. You know, go get those 4 pieces of data, and just, you know, you can start with a simple query like, what's the trip you have planned? And if the person gives 2 pieces of data, it goes ahead and it figures out what the other 2 pieces of data are that it needs and intelligently queries the user for it. That's really great functionality. If you've ever coded a form app online, you know, just a simple website form, it's amazing how long it takes and how many validations there are and how much work you have to do to just put in a 10-line, 10-field form. To be able to just specify, please get this data to Alexa and have it get it for you, that's kind of magical as a developer. And similarly, you have a lot of benefits with the NLU. Today, the NLUs, I don't think they're that sophisticated, but they're getting more sophisticated. And, you know, you look for it, you know, if we stay on the example of a travel app, an NLU can have a benefit of, if somebody says, I'm taking a trip, I want to go from here to Seattle. Well, hopefully it has the context of where here is. And these assistants do have that context. And so it automatically figures out that here means that I want to leave from Washington, D.C., where I am right now, and I want to travel to Seattle. That's a great thing. And if you think again about a traditional website form, there's no way you can just type in as your address or your departure place here. So it's really nice that it can just kind of figure things out in that natural way. So the AI is making a lot of things development-wise a lot easier. But on the other side of it, that makes testing much more important, because as it just provides these behaviors, then our role as builders of AI systems, not just developers, but we think of ourselves overall as the makers of these systems, we need to think about testing as, if not the first prerogative, it's a higher level prerogative than it is for a traditional system. And so it's overall, this is why testing is so important. And as these artificial intelligence platforms become smarter, what we're going to see is that this whole equation becomes more important, because it's going to take on more and more work, and then we, as builders of these systems, will be spending less time on coding, and we'll be spending more time on ensuring that the usability is correct, that the system is doing what we've asked it to do. So now that we've laid out all those changes, we want to tell you about what we think is the solution. And here we have a picture of Iron Man. And the reason why we use a picture of Iron Man is because we believe that testing is a superpower. And in particular, automated testing. So if you think about all those challenges that I was mentioning, the best way to overcome them is through test automation. And at each stage of the life cycle, test automation is really an essential thing. If we're talking about developers, what we offer in terms of manual testing tools, unit testing tools, those things are really going to rapidly accelerate your development. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But you can go at least 10 times faster using our unit testing tools. We think they're really a great thing. In addition, if you're talking about during the QA process and for QA folks, if you use our software for doing automated tests, it's going to allow you to go a lot faster because you're not going to have to be sitting there talking to a device endlessly. It's also going to allow you to have a much greater breadth of coverage because using our automated testing tools, you can actually go ahead and test in a lot of different languages and do it concurrently. Not many test teams have 10 different people that can work across all the different languages that are supported by Alexa and Google Assistant. And even if they did, it's hard to actually have them working simultaneously. But all this through automation can be achieved. So a lot of these challenges, we're happy to say that our tools can really help to solve them. And just some additional things to keep in mind, AI systems are based upon machine learning, and so that presents challenges. In particular, these are systems that are constantly evolving, and as they're improving, as they're changing, that can create changes within your app and its usability and its behavior. It really encourages adopting an agile approach to your whole development life cycle and your testing life cycle, in which testing is not just something discrete that happens once a quarter or once every 6 months, but instead it should match the cycle of the AI systems. It should be an ongoing thing. These are generally agile best practices. Building for AI platforms just reinforces them. Languages and locales, I touched upon this a little bit. But obviously, working across these is a big challenge, and it's something you need to keep in mind. And then lastly, platform behavior. There are these different platforms out there. Many folks are working with both Alexa and Google Assistant now. There's other platforms, obviously like Siri. Samsung will be coming out supposedly with theirs very soon. If you want to support all of these different platforms, you need tools that will allow you to test across them and ensure consistent behavior, because you're really not looking to have different behavior typically for a voice app from one to the next. You'd like it to have the same sort of experience across them. And so our tools can really help with that. Okay. And now I want to go into a little bit of a discussion around how our tools help these things. So we've told you a bit about why testing is important and why quality is important for voice, as well as what some of the benefits of our tools are. And so what are they? Well, if you look at this layer cake on the right-hand side here, there's really 4 different aspects to it and how we look at it. And that's manual testing, which I think everybody is doing to some extent today. And that's really about, just doing some ad hoc testing, making sure basic things are working correctly. There's a lot of ways to do this. We do have a particular approach that we'll tell you about, but lots of ways to do this, lots of great tools out there for it. And obviously this is a very important thing to do. Then layer 2 is automated unit testing. And automated unit testing is really going to be about making sure that your code is working correctly, making sure that that works well in isolation from the rest of the system. So you're not at this point testing speech recognition or AI. Ideally, you're not testing external dependencies like databases or web services. That would be more of an integration test. We leave integration tests out of here, but if you're really going for it, that's a good thing to include. But for your unit testing, you really want to make sure that that code is working correctly, that your skill is working correctly. And so we provide tools for that. End-to-end testing is then the other side of the coin from the testing. And that's about making sure that the entirety of your skill and experience works correctly. And that is looking at the behavior of the speech recognition of the AI up front, all the way through to any back-end pieces. It's testing the complete interaction, and with a special emphasis, or for testers, the really nice thing with this is it's going to enable you to address some of those concerns we mentioned up front. I mean, allowing you to try out different accents, different languages and locales. You can do all this using our end-to-end testing. And then lastly, at the bottom here, we have continuous testing. A lot of people may know this as monitoring. We call it continuous testing just to emphasize that we use the same approach for continuous testing, or the same underlying technology for continuous testing that we use for the end-to-end testing. But the difference is that we'll take in one of our end-to-end testing flows, and then we run it on a regular 30-minute interval, and then we notify you if there's any issues at all. So you're not going to typically do the same level of depth for a continuous test. It's going to be 3 or 4 interactions, sort of a happy path through a skill. But whereas your end-to-end test might have hundreds of test cases, but by having that sort of simple happy path being run on a regular basis, it's going to make sure that everything is working correctly. It's going to detect any issues in any part of your system, and any things, any little subtle changes in behavior that could affect performance. So it's an extra level of insurance that you get with that. So the manual testing, lots of different ways to do this. As I mentioned, one thing I would highlight about what we offer with our manual testing is that it actually works completely locally. And for everything that we do that's oriented for development, we really focus on doing things locally. And there's a really important reason for that. If you can develop and debug and test scenarios all on your laptop without having to do deployments to Lambda or to a server, without having to update your interaction model in the Alexa development console, you are going to go much, much faster. I think it's actually conservative to say that you'll have a 10x improvement by using localized development versus doing it with deployments. It takes a long time to do a deployment. It takes a long time to use the Ask CLI, even if you automate it, to update your interaction model. If you can actually do those tests without doing any deployment, you can run through 3 or 4 or 10 scenarios in the time that it takes you to do just one scenario in that model. So it really does go a lot faster. And that's a nice thing about our tools there. And for the unit testing, we use the same approach. And so if you run our unit tests locally, it tests all the code locally. No need for any deployment. It's really helpful in that it's going to give you this overall sense of the quality of your code and this great regression suite. But just as importantly, I mean, this is one of the things we really emphasize for people with unit testing. It's not something, where you're going to pay for quality with your time. A lot of people look at unit testing that way, in that, if I set this up, the good news is that I'll have a higher quality app. Bad news is it's going to take more time to deliver. It'll take a couple more weeks. That's really not true. This is going to accelerate your development because, again, it's going to allow you to run all your tests locally. which is much faster. It can allow you to jump to complex stages in a process. So if you have 5 interactions before you hit a particular state, where you think you have a bug and you're trying to figure out what happened, if you are doing that manually, if you're interacting with a device to get to that 5th step, that's incredibly tedious, error-prone, and slow. Whereas you can write a unit test, you can just type it out that runs through those 5 steps, repeat it endlessly and perfectly. You know, it's going to have the exact same result that every time you run it. That is incredibly helpful for debugging things. And then once you do have that all debugged and it's all working, then you do get all those quality benefits. But it's really great to keep in mind with unit testing that it's not just going to allow you to have something that's higher quality. It really is going to accelerate your development. And one thing I would highlight that's a nice thing is we're now part of the Alexa tutorials and samples. You can check out the Node.js fact example that we have here. We have a number more that are on the way. And so we've been working with the Alexa team to include these projects. And we think it's great. We're excited to get developers doing as much unit testing as possible and building higher quality stuff. And we're excited that Amazon agrees and thinks that it's very important as well. With the system testing or the end-to-end testing, as I mentioned, this is the other side of the coin. Here we're actually interacting with Alexa itself. And so the tests for end-to-end testing, I'm going to show you both unit tests and end-to-end tests. The tests look very similar, but what they do underneath the covers is totally different, because the unit test, that is not interacting with Alexa at all. We actually we use an emulator, which means we generate JSON locally that looks like the JSON that comes from Alexa, but it's not coming from Alexa. Well, in the case of an end-to-end test, we are actually interacting with Alexa. We generate speech based on the test that you create. We send that to Alexa. It sends it to your skill, gets back a response. We turn that response, which is at least partially audio, back into text, and then we compare it to the expected response. So the tests look similar. In both cases, you're basically saying, here's what I want to say, and here's what I'm expecting in response, but then very different things happening underneath the covers. And the really nice thing about this end-to-end testing is it's not the place to test every scenario in your code. It's the place to make sure that your interaction model, that your system as a whole is really working perfectly. And so you want to be thinking about testing those different pieces, or making sure that you use unit tests for the right thing and using end-to-end tests for the right thing. And then lastly, continuous testing. As I mentioned, this is just something you set it up, and then hopefully you just forget about it. You'll get an email from us once a week that summarizes, here's the results. But if you don't have any errors, that's it. But if you do have any errors, if there's any problems, we're going to alert you. And you can see what the issue is. It might be something that's kind of a false alarm, or it might be something that indicates a real problem with your skill. And then you can go in and take a look and fix it. So it's very helpful, very easy to set up, gives you this extra layer of assurance. And then lastly, we're very proud of the work that we've done with Mercedes. And we set up what we consider to be sort of the ideal for automation and testing for voice, and did an entire workflow. I won't go through every aspect of it, but it's an entire workflow in which it's not just using these tools that I talked about, with the unit testing, end-to-end testing, and the monitoring. It's actually using them all in an overall automated process in which every time somebody makes changes, we go ahead and we run the unit tests. And if there's any problem, then we alert people and say, hey, something's wrong with the code. And then every time there's changes that are supposed to go out to the QA team, we automatically deploy those changes. And then we automatically run our end-to-end tests. and if there's a problem, again, there's an alert. So, you put out a test build and you want to make sure that that's working well before the QA people go in, that no functionality is broken. It does all that automatically. And if it gets through that, then you can repeat the same cycle for deployments to production. So this is, in our mind, really the state of the art of automation. It combines our tools with things like Jenkins, with things like SonarQube, really great products, and they all work together to ensure quality and to also accelerate that development and delivery process. All right, so now we're going to get into doing some demos. I'm just going to take a quick look just to see if there's any questions here. All right, I don't see any questions. That means I'm either doing a really great job of explaining things, or you guys have all lost interest. Hopefully it's the former. So right here, we have an example of one of our end-to-end tests. So we set this up. This is for a grocery list skill. It's a very simple skill, which is one of the reasons why we chose it. And it really just has 3 intents, which is add something to my list, tell me what's on my list, and remove something from my list. So very easy to understand what's going on with it. But at the same time, we can demonstrate some of the power of what we do with this, because it's also in multiple different languages, and there's some variability of responses, and just some different test scenarios that are a little bit trickier, but that we can show you how nicely our tool can handle that. But to start with the simplest possible test here, you really can get a lot of mileage out of writing tests as easy as this, and they're going to give you a level of assurance. And what you're doing is you're saying on the left-hand side, open bring, and bring is the skill name. And that's what's going to be said to Alexa. And then on the right-hand side, you're saying what the expected response is, which in this case is welcome to bring. So very simple interaction there. But do keep in mind, this is actually going and talking to Alexa as if I was a person speaking to it, saying open bring. It then turns it over to the skill. Skill sends back a response. That response is an audio. We turn it back into text, and then we compare it here. So looks very simple, but we are taking care of a lot of things behind the scenes for you. Now a slightly more complex example here. We're going to open the skill, then we say what's on my list, then we say add an item to my list, and then we say goodbye. So one, it's important to highlight that we can work through whole conversations and interactions. That's a capability of the system, of course. And then we can also do things here, like we can have a wildcard. So in this case, we want to make sure that it understood what is on my list and it came back with generally the correct response. But we're not going to check every item in that response, because that might vary. It has to do with setting up state. That can be a little bit tricky. So in those cases, we can just use a wildcard. And we also support regular expressions here, which will work similar to a wildcard, but are actually a lot more powerful. So if you have some very complex scenario that you're looking at checking return values on, regular expression can be very helpful. In addition, then we go on to the next step, and we're confirming the reply. And then down here, when we say goodbye, this is an example of where this skill includes variable responses. This is a recommended user experience thing to incorporate. You want to feel more conversational, and so it's good to vary up what you say to people, even though the intent is the same. Having it give slight variations, it makes it feel a little more human. And we can test for that, where you can specify a list of responses. And any one of these, if it's what's returned, will be accepted. So when we say goodbye, talk to you soon. Sorry, I hope you guys can still hear me. I have some dogs here. You can say talk to you soon or bye-bye, happy shopping. And either one of those will be accepted. And then here, in our last case, we get even a little bit more complicated, where we're starting to look at a variety of different attributes. So we can look at the prompt, a reprompt, a card title, card content, really get into testing deeper aspects of what's returned. And you can test everything from the cards, the display information, all of that is possible to test in these end-to-end tests. So it's meant to be a very simple syntax. We have a lot of non-programmers who are able to use this very successfully. At the same time, it's very expressive and powerful. Now, to run these tests, we actually just go over here, and I'm going to go ahead and run this one. Now, it doesn't run very fast, and that's because when we run these end-to-end tests, we are actually interacting with Alexa, and it goes at about the same speed as if you were speaking to it. So it's not real fast there. And just while I'm doing this, so we can see over here, yeah, we can actually see these interactions as they're happening. Now, I don't know if you guys can hear that, but you can actually then play back what is said. So you can hear the audio that we've sent to Alexa and what that interaction is. It's really, this is a very helpful debugging tool. It's also helpful just in terms of understanding what's happening. We are really interacting with Alexa using these test scripts just as if we were a user. And then if I go back over here, so it also works across languages. So here we have tests written in German. And we've put together these tests successfully. We don't have any German speakers on our team. We've put together tests in Japanese successfully. We definitely don't have any Japanese speakers on our team. And we just do that by, you use Google Translate, trial and error, looking at the responses coming back, and you're able to build these tests, working across different languages. And this is obviously something that if you're trying to do it manually, talking to a device, that would be very, very difficult to do. And let's see. Another thing I would just highlight here, we do use Amazon Polly to generate the speech. And so that provides a lot of flexibility. There's a number of different voices with Amazon Polly. And so this obviously allows you to work in many different languages, as well as creating different accents and testing different sort of user scenarios. Really, really a great tool. And we make it easy to work with these different parts of it. And just going to check over here before I go further. I see two questions. So I am a small shop of one. Will pricing be scaled for SMB, or will it be one for all? It's not scaled at the moment, but we are looking for ways to do that. We'll probably move towards a transactional model at some point, so that we can support that. But right now, it's not scaled. That said, Thomas, happy to follow up with you and see if we can find a way to make it work for you. We are interested in helping everyone to do great testing. And then John, I see yes. So this supports every language Alexa does. Yes, it does. We support every language that they're out there in, and you can test effectively across all those. And all right, so now to talk a little bit about the unit testing piece. So the unit tests look quite similar. We're using the same YAML-based syntax. And in this case, I've actually pulled up, this is one of the sample projects that we did with Amazon. This is for the get fact. And so here you're just specifying which intent. You can also say the utterance, but in this case, we just specify the intents. And you just work through these interactions. And here you actually get access to the raw JSON of your skill response. So you can actually test it even at a greater level of depth than you can with the end-to-end testing. Anything that you send back in the response payload can be tested. And you set up these tests, and you run them in the same way. Oh, I actually neglected. So here are the results from our previous run. So it went through and it ran. And we got an error where it didn't understand something that we said. And this is an example of something with the interaction model. It probably needs to be tweaked because it seems to have a problem recognizing bananas. And that's kind of interesting. And that's one type of debugging that you might do where you're not going to change code to fix that. That's about playing with your interaction model to fix it. And then here, this is just a straight up error where we're saying the card title should be something and it's not. Now in this case, there's no cards for this skill. We include this to show an error as well as to show the card testing capability. But this is easy to fix. You just update the test and remove the card title expectation. But if it was supposed to be this and you weren't returning it, then you go ahead and fix your code and add the card in. Similarly, for running our unit tests, now you should see these are going to run quite a bit faster. Again, it's running completely locally. So that took 3 seconds to run. Our other tests ran at 54 seconds. And we ran through a lot more scenarios here. And that's the benefit, you know, again, the unit testing is really so helpful because this is going to allow you to really test your code quickly and locally. And that's a really helpful thing. But it's not going to test anything with the speech recognition. It's not going to test anything with the AI. So it really is a very different animal. And we can even look at the code coverage for this. So some of you may not be familiar with code coverage, but this is actually just built into using our unit tests. And this is such a great guide for working through your code. If you write some code and then you start putting together some unit tests, you can just use the code coverage to guide you in terms of where do you need to add additional tests. So you add a test, see if that improves the code coverage, add another test, work through it. And you know, working towards the idea that you want to have code coverage set up for the bulk of your code. You don't need it, you know, a good rule of thumb is you want like 85, 90% code coverage. You don't need to be 100%. But it's it's a good mantra to live by, that if you haven't tested code and if you haven't written automated unit tests for your code, it's sort of guilty until proven innocent. You know, your code, it doesn't work unless you've actually shown that it works. I know that you know, some developers might say, well, that's BS, you know, I'm a great developer. I can tell you personally, I don't think I'm a bad developer. I have found that to be true, that the code that I don't test, amazingly, no matter how simple it is and how impossible it is for me to imagine that something could go wrong, it does go wrong. Being a software developer, you definitely learn to believe in Murphy's Law. So unit testing, it's a great protection against Murphy's Law. So very easy to set up these tests and run them. One thing I would highlight, I am showing you everything in our YAML syntax. But we have very robust APIs underneath these. So if you get into more complex scenarios, and those do exist, you can use those APIs to handle more complicated testing scenarios. Like, let's take an example. Say that, we could take the travel example I had before. You want to test a slot value for city destinations. And you've got, it's a worldwide travel app, so you've got thousands of destinations. So you could load all those destinations into a flat file, or maybe you even get them from a web service, and use our programmatic API to run them through. And what might that look like? I mean, our YAML syntax is really easy to work with. Our APIs, I mean, it's better, you know, if you're not a programmer, this is probably not going to be the greatest thing for you, but it's really not hard code to write. Basically, you just create one of these virtual devices, is what we call it, and you send your message to it, which is what you want to say. And then you get back to payload. That's really about all there is to it. If I wanted to create the code to do the example I just said, I call a web service here, get back the response, loop through it, saying message. And then I check something on the result. I could probably write what I just described to you in 20 lines of code or less. Really not very difficult. And so these APIs are very useful. And we have that for both our end-to-end testing as well as our unit testing. So you can do those more complicated examples. And let me just check my presentation. I think I covered. Yeah, just one other thing before I start taking some questions. We have a lot of best practices, but just some high-level ones that we'd want you to keep in mind is, you know, you use test scripts during development and QA. You know, you use your unit tests as well as your end-to-end test scripts. You know, the unit test for development, end-to-end test scripts for development and QA. Use the monitoring once your app is live. You can also, if you want an extra level of security, or if you're in a very agile process, you can have test scripts running automatically on a daily or weekly basis. That's easy to configure. And then lastly, you know, we can help people set up tests. Our business is not to be professional testers, but we're expert at it, and we're happy to help people. So if you want help either managing some tests or just getting started, reach out to us. We can really get you going rather fast. We've actually started offering up these automation expert appointments. Yvonne, who's on this call, is one of our automation experts. And, you know, our saying is, the automation expert is like a Apple genius, except with more automation and less attitude. That's our slogan. We think in an hour we can really help you get a lot going with testing. So please do touch base with us. We'd love to help you accelerate and improve your QA processes. With that, I'm going to jump over here and take a look at the questions. Which code coverage tools use? That's a great question. I will say, I would just clarify there that Travis and Circle CI are continuous integration and continuous delivery tools. For code coverage, we are typically using codecov.io. The only other really popular product is Coveralls. Codecov is better. That is all, though, for hosted. The code coverage I showed you here, this is not hosted. This is just automatically generated every time I run my tests. So it goes underneath the coverage folder. I click here, and then I go here. I didn't do anything to generate that, and it's not because I did some fancy setup. If you start using this, it'll just be there for you. Same thing. What else? More questions? I didn't look at the questions tab here. One thing I forgot to mention up front also is we will send out the slides as well. So, you know, the slides that we went through during this presentation, we will make those available. And at the back of them, we have links on how to get started. We do weekly office hours. I'll also mention this. So the office hours, you know, it's just a chance to ask us questions. We tend to have a lot of people come to these webinars. Not that many people come to office hours, but it's there and it's a resource that we offer. And, you know, if you want to ask us really anything about voice development, we're happy to answer it during that time. So certainly please do take advantage of it. And yes, here's our automation expertise. So you can set those appointments as well. And then a whole variety of links. I think a lot of the stuff I touched upon today, it's all in here. You know, links to docs, links to the programmatic APIs, links to our case study with Mercedes. If you haven't looked at our case study with Mercedes, we really encourage you to do that. We're really proud of the work that we did there. We think the Mercedes team has been proud of it as well. And, you know, we like to think that we've laid out the roadmap for how people should do testing and automation for voice there. And I see a question. Yes, John, you can test the audio player and video app as well. Video app, I don't know if I have an example of, but we have a great example of the audio player. This is one that will actually very soon be part of the Alexa repositories, but right now we have it over here. So this is the Alexa audio player sample, and these are tests that we put together for it. And it's not a small thing to make it easy to test the audio player, but I think we have. Oh, sorry. I'm not sharing my screen. I'm just talking about it. This is what I was referring to. Testing audio player in other languages has been a challenge for me. Why is that? I mean, I mean, why is it any more difficult than testing any type of skill in another language? Oh, okay, right. I agree. So, you know, the genesis for our emulator for the unit testing piece was an early project I did with the audio player. I think that unit testing is essential for any skill you develop, but trying to test the audio player functionality, doing that manually without having a unit testing framework is just brutal. And so that was the beginning of us putting together this emulator and all of our unit testing pieces. So I definitely understand the pain there. And I didn't even talk about cool stuff that we do with locales, but we have great locale support built in. We actually support internationalization, so you can internationalize different phrases. Pushing towards the goal that you can have a single set of test scripts that work across many different languages. And not everybody's worried about that at this moment, but I think it's a nice sign of the maturity of what we've done, that we do support that. And appreciate everyone that answered the polls here. Very helpful feedback. And I see, what other topics should we cover? The end-to-end testing, the QA, that's very popular, and the Bespoken command line tools. We're probably really overdue to do something on our tools as a whole. One of the most common pieces of feedback we get is people aren't quite sure where to start with their stuff. We do have a lot of stuff. I apologize if it's a little confusing at times. We're trying to improve that. We're also getting ready to launch BST 2.0, so the second version of our command line tools. So maybe our next webinar will be focused on that. I think it's a nice time to talk about that and talk about all the great stuff we do with that. One last thing I'll mention before I leave, next week I will be in Seattle. I think we'll be doing some Twitch streams with the Amazon team, in particular on how to set up really a first-class development environment for Alexa development. Really excited about that. Talking about things like getting the AskCLI set up, VS Code, unit testing. Really putting together what we think are best practices for professional Alexa development. We should have the information about that out soon. Really encourage you guys to check that out. I'll be doing that with Memo Doring from the Alexa team. Any more questions? We'll hold on another minute and then we'll close this down. We're not in a rush though, so if you have questions, please ask. I love that question. I hope I say your name correctly, Bijou. What are the tools required for setting up an Alexa DevOps? I should have a really cool example of this. Another thing that we're actually working on with Amazon is to come up with, to go beyond just basic stuff into what we consider to be sort of industrial grade skill practices. And we should have your email. You might shoot me a note, just remind me to send it to you. I'll try to remember, but I should have a good example project of what I consider to be the standard tools, and really showing how it works. But a short answer to that question is using a CI/CD tool like Travis or Jenkins or Circle. We personally prefer Circle as a company, but Travis and Jenkins. Well, Jenkins is a very popular option for enterprises, a bit overcomplicated. Travis is a great one as well. But any one of those is great for setting up your CI and CD workflow. And then you want to have your code coverage in place with something like codecov.io. And then you want to have your testing in place. And that's, we think the answer there is using our unit testing and end-to-end testing tools. And then if you want extra credit, you use the Ask CLI to automate your deployment. That's a little bit trickier, but that's doable as well. I could probably show you some examples of that if that's something that you're trying to do. And that is something we do for Mercedes and we've done for some of our own projects. All right, guys. Well, I think we're just about done. It's 1:59. Really appreciate everyone coming to this. Hope it was helpful. You can email Yvonne. You can email me if you think it was great. Email Yvonne if you think it was terrible. Tell them. Actually, brutal feedback is appreciated, or any feedback is appreciated. So please feel free to reach out to us and let us know. And hopefully you'll join us for upcoming office hours or our next webinar. So see you soon and have a great week.